There we go. Well, thank you everybody for coming back in. And as I said, we'll have the slides from this class posted on the website as well as a recording. And we've added, or I will be adding a bunch of new content tomorrow to the website, which is kcowa.us/advisory group DEI. So be sure to check back. This is the third class, the fourth session, but the third class of our diversity, equity, and inclusion training for Kitsap County Advisory Group members and staff. This is implementing equity tools for planning and collaborations. And please feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll be able to kind of break in and ask those as we go along. And be sure to take the survey at the end of the course. It will provide us some vital input and feedback on this, as well as gives you an opportunity for other training as an advisory group member or staff that you'd like to see us do. So without further ado, I'll introduce again Lucretia Robertson, who's brought us this awesome series of classes, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone who's hanging out with me tonight. I know as it gets later and colder, we just want to be snuggled in with our blankets and by the fireplace. At least that's for me. Over the last few sessions, we've been talking about equity in such a way to help us think more intentionally about how we are including the perspective and voices of folks who are often marginalized, or you might hear me refer to them as under-recognized. And essentially, the point that I'm making is that we are born into systems that have been established or built around ideas of who gets the most resources, who gets the most attention, who gets access, who do we design programs and policies and systems for? And so we're thinking about equity in a way that says we can step in and make some small and or big changes that are significant enough to change and to correct imbalances in the systems, right? And so that is true across any identity. We've talked about exploring those identities, and that is true regardless of our role. What are the ways in which we can not only kind of unpack our bias and unravel some of these patterns and habits that we have as committees and as organizations, but what are the ways that we can be intentional to include different voices and perspectives in order to shape policies and practices, programs, all of those things that take all of those experiences into account. And I said this in the first class, and I'll repeat this now, that equity benefits everyone, right? So giving everyone the same thing, regardless of where they start, does not really get us to a place where people are included and truly feel as if they're able to participate. And I'll go so far as to say, experience the American dream. Giving people what they need for where they're at, especially considering the legacy of this country and the history of legislation. Considering those things, we know that people start at different places. So where might we step in and use our ability, our strengths, our talents, our power, and this newfound awareness to give people what they need, right? And that's around equity. So before I share my slides to kind of close this out, I wanted to share 3 documents that Rebecca's gonna put on the portal, on the website, as a way for us to think more intentionally around equity, and also as a way for us to start out developing our own tools. I suggest that you develop your own tools specific to your use as a committee member to be part of like this greater toolkit and this resource that we want to use. So I'm going to share a few things, and then we'll get to the slide. So the first thing I'm sharing is it right here? Hopefully we can see it. Can we see it? Can we see it, Rebecca? Do you know?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to share is this idea of creating an equity toolkit for public engagement. And we know that engagement is used interchangeably with involvement and participation. It could be simply having folks show up at your meetings. It could be folks participating in surveys and assessments. It could be folks, lending their thoughts and contributions to a major decision that needs to be made or some recommendation, volunteering to be part of your committee, whatever that might be. But when we think about public engagement and we think about ensuring inclusion, we have to take an equity approach. So I pulled together a kind of a simple, I don't want to say guide, but instructions on how you might pull together an equity toolkit for public engagement. It is a detailed guide on how to use an equity impact tool, but it will have other items in the toolkit to help you think about what you're hoping to accomplish, who you serve, and what barriers might be in place. So that is a equity toolkit. And there's a list here of what you might want to create or include in your toolkit. Be aware that many of these things could probably be found online, and you can tweak it and adapt it to your particular needs. So that is one. The other thing I wanted to share was an example of a equity impact tool. And so this will be in on your portal as well. This is an example of a document you might create as a tool to help guide you through discussions around the impacts of a decision. It could be a small decision, right? Or it could be a big decision. And so there's steps in here to move through. I would suggest that you move through it slowly, not to rush through these steps so that you can think deeply about the responses to some of these questions. Obviously, we're going to start at, what are our shared goals as a committee? It's really important to get out onto the table, out into the open. What are we hoping to accomplish? And having a good, robust conversation about that, because that helps us to also think about, is what we're hoping to accomplish even measurable, right? So we want to establish a goal that's measurable. For example, if the goal is we want to increase, diverse perspectives at our public meetings, then what does that mean in the way of a measurable goal? If you're talking about increasing, you should know what it is now and where you hope for it to be. And also, what do you hope to accomplish by having diverse perspectives? So this is an example of an equity impact tool. I would suggest that it's just something to use to kind of model your own tool. You may need to create a tool that's simpler to kind of start out with, which makes absolute sense. And we're all starting at this from different places. And I think if you create a simpler tool that would ensure some quicker wins, that might be a place to start instead of, creating a complicated tool and frustrating yourself. So walking through this tool together. And I would suggest that if your committee, if your group is intentional about this, that maybe you work on the tool over time and just continue to develop, different elements of it. It might just be that you only have 2 or 3 questions, but that's a place to start thinking about where are we intentionally removing barriers. And then the last one I wanted to share before I jump into my slides is a self-guided equity assessment. So this is for use by individuals or committee members or decision makers. And essentially what I pulled together for you is an assessment that you would use either as a reflection or kind of talk through as a committee to critically assess what might be your potential impacts of a decision or an action you're about to take, and what might be some core considerations that you should have at the forefront of your mind or put on the table as part of that conversation. What I did was I broke it out into 3 levels, particularly because, again, we start where we're at. It's more meaningful, it's more thoughtful, it doesn't feel performative if we do what we have the capacity to do, and then build on that capacity to do more. So foundationally, you'll have a set of questions, and then as you're progressively comfortable or more adept at asking these questions, you may ask immediate, intermediate, or advancing questions. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't jump to advancing. I am suggesting that oftentimes in our attempt to do more and to do better, we are not aware of the harm that we're doing, right? So to do less harm to people, what we do is we start where we're at with what we've learned, to ask the simple questions and to help us start thinking about and widen our lens. Remember, widen our lens by asking some foundational questions. So I think this is 2 pages. Well, maybe it's 3. And they're just a series of questions that I would encourage as a committee, or maybe individually, you can do this before you meet with your committee and start asking yourself these questions and see where your answers take you. I think that what you'll find is that your answers will take you to a place where you need to either get more information, you need to invite different perspectives, or you need to pause on a decision until you have what you need to more robustly answer those questions. So I'll stop share of that, and Rebecca will have those in the portal. And then I will share my slides for the remainder of our time together. So we talked about a lot of things around equity. And I even posed what I shared around equity as a tool for you to use in your own conversations, right? So maybe you don't feel comfortable facilitating this conversation, but you can take one of the slides, one of the models, one of the diagrams, some of the questions, and sit down with your committee to say, what are your thoughts about this? Or here's something that I've learned. Have we considered this? How do we do this thing that's outlined in this diagram? What does inclusive engagement look like for us? Are we truly inclusive? Maybe there's something that we can improve, and there are people that we can ask. So I encourage you again that in this training and any training that you take, that you use the materials that's before you, not only for your own learning and reflection, but as a model, something that you can kind of adapt or maybe even duplicate in your committee discussions as part of an icebreaker, as part of setting up team norms and team agreements, as part of getting to know one another better, resolving conflict, thinking through some of the actions and decisions that you're taking. Even, I will go so far as to say, planning a social gathering. Are we thinking about equity in that context? And we can. Those are simpler ways to do that. All right. All right. So what we've been talking about all along has been around taking individual steps, ensuring our individual actions together lead to quality institutional decisions and planning. So when we talked about, I shared the lens of systemic oppression, we talked about different ways in which systems have been continued to create inequities or imbalances across different arenas, different dimensions. That's usually individual, interpersonal, institutional, and across systems. That's kind of what this image here is sharing. Why I share this image is because I want us to always remember that the systems will only systems deliver what they're set up to deliver, right? They produce what they're set up to produce. And so at an individual or at a individual level, I should say, when we do the work to explore our own identity, we can have more awareness about how how identity shows up in places that create barriers for other people. So there was a participant in the last session in the hour before that brought out the point of having these slides available ahead of time so that they can see them because of, if I'm remembering correctly, there might be a low visibility. And that is perfect, not perfect, but that is an instance where my identity, the way that it showed up in this space was, well, I can see this, I can read it, it's accessible to me, not thinking through to the end that maybe there is someone who has lower visibility who needs these slides in advance. So that's a prime example of a way to think about how my identity, our identities are showing up in ways to create barriers for other people. And then when I say people, I want to remind us that part of moving systems change is centering relationships. We have to have relationships, and because those are the places in which people share information, they share their ideas and perspectives, particularly if those perspectives are ones that are different from the norm, right? Those are the relationships in which we get more information, anecdotal probably, that would help us to reimagine the systems and the organizations that we are part of. So relationships, centering those relationships are really important. It could be organization to organization, individual to individual, and committee to committee. But regardless of the context, centering those relationships and putting people at the center of those relationships are really important. So we don't change the people, we're changing the system. And then we align those with our organizational values. That is really important to explore. I think sometimes they go unstated in our organizations. We don't often talk about what does it mean when we say our value is equity? Well, what does that mean for us? Really important to define that because the public, the people in which you are serving and engaging, they see the disconnect. And it's good for to create, I don't want to say harmony, but it's good to create alignment on your committees if we're really clear about what are our values and how do we go about demonstrating those values. Also aligning your values helps to build and foster trust with the people that you serve. I think I'm saying what people already know, but when we talk about equity very specifically and inclusion, it's really important to be clear about what that means to us as a committee and organization, and what are our limitations? What is our capacity in this regard? There's nothing wrong with being clear about we don't have the budget or the bandwidth or the people to support big dreams around equity, but we can support up to a certain level, and that's fair. That allows us to be transparent and also consistent in the way that we deliver programs and follow through on policies. And then all of that is to say, as we make those incremental changes and adaptation in ourselves and our interpersonal relationships across our committees and organizations, they are small changes sometimes, but they make a big difference to the system, right? So what if everyone made the habit of, using Lucretia as an example, preparing information in advance to ensure that anyone with low visibility had access to it way in advance, and went so far as to create platforms or pathways where someone with low visibility who maybe doesn't have access to large screen or large print could go get it printed or have it available to check out a computer. So I'm speaking big, but the whole point is that we're working incrementally to make these systems changes. So now let's put some of these models to work and think through what some of what I shared and how we might use some of what I shared. So what I want us to think about in the next scenarios, and I will talk through some of these, is what would we ask or do to ensure inclusion and to advance equity? So when we think about these scenarios, I just want us to reflect on it. There's no right or wrong answer because we're learning, but we are going back to the models that were available to us to think about what might be our response and what might be our actions. When we think about these scenarios, I want you to consider, what is your goal? As I said before, putting that out on the table and making it explicit helps us to quantify and qualify what we're hoping to accomplish. So it's really important as committee members to talk through, if our goal is around ensuring equity, those are big words. What are we hoping to accomplish? What does that look like? Let's jot that down. Let's write it down and be really clear about it. Because after you take the action, you want to be able to go back to that goal. I think I'm saying the obvious, to be able to say, did we accomplish this? And where were the barriers along the way, either for us or that underrepresented organization or individual? The other thing I want you to think about is, what tool or model should you reference? I don't think we remember all the tools or models, but that's okay because you can do this exercise for yourself at a later time. Go on that website, pull up some of what was shared with you, and answer for yourself, what would I look at to help me think, to spur my thinking around questions and the next course of action? And then what core questions should you ask in particular to this scenario? We use the questions as a way to explore, again, our bias, to surface our assumptions, and to check the information we have or don't have, right? Questions are a way to invite curiosity and also as a way to prompt us to think deeply about what is before us. So that's why I put that there. And I don't mean to overtalk it, but it's often helpful to think about these things when we're using, a pretty static model that you've only seen once or twice. Is I want you to think about it in a way that's spurring you in a creative way to think differently. Let's see. All right. So we have a few scenarios, right? We're asking, how do we ensure inclusion and advance equity? And of the three scenarios, I'll read them. One of them is, you are conducting interviews for new committee members. That may be a task you have. You're working on a committee to determine grant funding. I gotta change that. Or you are working in a group to provide a recommendation to a decision maker. And I think I've captured generally some of the work that committee members are a part of, but you could take any aspect of these scenarios and put yourself in the place of someone who has to make a decision or be part of a group that's making a decision, and you're thinking through, what are the equity impacts? What am I not considering as part of this decision? So for the first one, where we talk about the scenario is candidate interviews, assuming that our goal is to ensure that the interview process is equitable, to promote a fair and consistent process where everyone has a chance to be interviewed and considered, I might suggest that we look at like implicit bias. We explore, what are the biases we hold about individuals who are in this role? Are we saying that they should be collaborative or competitive? But what does that look like, right? When we say that, oftentimes we have ideas about, well, collaborative looks like, and I'm putting labels on it. That's my experience. It might not be yours, but collaborative looks like a woman, but competitive looks like a man. And I say that because I'm in HR, and these are the things that we're constantly working to undo. So thinking about bias in that regards, what are the implicit biases that I hold? And oh, by the way, how is that then informing how I frame information that I deliver and information that I hear, right? So is my leaning towards what they don't have as opposed to what they do have. What's the assets that this person brings to the table that might make them suitable for a committee role, let's say. And then also thinking about bias and framing is also thinking about appearance, it's thinking about presentation, it's thinking about language and style, all of the things that very early on were socialized to believe are reflections of competency, ability, knowledge, all of those things. What are the practices I'm putting in place to set that aside so that it's a fair process, right? Or I might think about like the diagram I shared about equality and equity. That's a great visual to help us remember and think about when we're interviewing. Is the goal to provide an equal experience or an equitable experience, right? So in the instance of someone who may have, who may not be a native English speaker, have we ensured that there is a translator or an interpreter available to be part of this interview process? And if they were on the committee, are we prepared? Have we established a process by which we have a translator and interpreter? And I would encourage you to think about that because, again, we're making decisions not about changing the person, but changing the system. So to say, for example, to someone who's a non-native English speaker, you need to speak English to be on this committee, puts the responsibility on them, as opposed to this system needs to be changed to allow everyone to fairly participate. So what do we put in place to remove that barrier about English having to be spoken? So then those are the core questions. What barriers exist? Let's think through all of the ways in which we've established kind of roadblocks or reinforced roadblocks that have nothing to do with actively participating on this committee. And where and to whom have we shared this opportunity? So this is about communication. This is about platforms in which we share this information. This is about the extent to which we are inclusive in the process. So that's that. Oh, this button. So I wanted to just share really quickly 2 responses that I might have, which I've already shared, is we might use the model exploring identities. Okay, so how does my identity show up in this space to create an opportunity or a barrier for another person? Great exercise to go through with your committee prior to doing any interviews. And then I talked about the framing effect, right? This is a reminder. If you look at this picture, it looks like the person is looking one way, away from me or towards me. It's just a reminder that our bias can influence the way in which information is delivered and received. I hope that's helpful to people. So let's go to the next one. So we have a grant application review, and I say, the goal is to evaluate grant applications on a fair, equitable, and an objective process. And maybe the model we use is an equity lens. We talked several times about an equity lens as a way to prime us to think deeply. I shared an equity impact tool with you. I shared that table with the assessment questions. So those are a place to start. We can look at the public engagement choice points, right? So along the way, how are we choosing to engage the public as part of this process? You'll have to make that decision as a committee. But as we engage the public in this process, we should ask why. So why is, so for example, along this process, we talked about involve or collaborate or empower. Why have we chose evolve as a place to start? It's really good to kind of explore why start there as opposed to collaborate. It may be a justifiable reason, but those are things to talk through. But using the choice points to help us understand the platforms or how we would communicate expectations around the grant application and how we would collect feedback and information. And then I also suggested, look at the strategies to ensure public engagement. Okay, we have this grant application. What are all the ways that we've used this document that I said, use it as a checklist? What are all the ways that we can go through this list to ensure diverse representation, inclusion in meetings, feedback loops, accountability, all of those other things. And so the core questions we're asking ourselves, our committee at this point of the grant application review to ensure equity, remember, is what method are we going to use to review the data? That's something I think needs to be talked out. There is often, because I've been part of those conversations, an assumption that we're all using the same methodology, but discussing the methodology helps us to work through where there might be misunderstanding, and also where my experience is coming into play and someone else's experience is coming into play, and maybe that doesn't work well together. So we have to find a methodology that is truly fair and objective. Is the review criteria clear? I have been part of grant funding reviews, and the criteria has not been very clear. The criteria is clear to those who participated in the past and either were not awarded the grant or just by chance were awarded the grant until they figured it out. But is the review criteria clear? Not only the timeline, but what you're looking for, an example of what you're looking for, things of that nature. What you'll consider most, least, what has the most weight? Does anything have any weight? Those things. The other question is there a mechanism for answering questions before, during, and after the process? We're talking about feedback, we're talking about accountability, we're talking about building trust. So as part of this grant review process, before it starts, where do I get my questions answered? And is that happening on multiple platforms? So not just go to this website and read what's on there, but we're going to have an information session. We're going to have special pop-ups. We printed materials to go out to different groups. We're sending it to you. We sent you an email. We have someone who's a point of contact. Those types of things, because that is where equity comes in. Because again, it says, in the past, I've not had success or been aware of this experience. And equity ensures that everyone has what they need in order to fully participate, right? So it's not a one size fits all. And again, during and after the process, what mechanism is there to get questions answered and to provide feedback? Feedback is so important as part of undoing systemic issues, because as decision makers, you get to go back and say, next year, we're going to tweak the methodology. We're going to change the way we deliver information. We're going to revisit the criteria, all of those things. We're going to find ways to answer questions in advance so that people can fully participate. So that's where equity comes in. And I've already mentioned multiple platforms to deliver information about the grant process. So again, I talked about equity, equality, and equity. There was a handout that I had that's part of the portal. So you can go there and look and see if there's more information around equity and equality. There's clearly more information online that goes deeper into what does equity look like. But when I'm talking about equity, think about it in all of its dimensions, right? So that's resource equity. That's equity in the way of opportunity and access. That's equity in all its ways. So that's a way to think about equity. And then I already talked about using the strategies for inclusive public engagement as a checklist. Again, everything that I've shared with you is a tool that you can use to help model and shape your goals and conversations around advancing equity. So this too is a tool that I brought up in this conversation. So then the last scenario we're talking about is forming recommendations. So I would offer that more than likely, our goal is to provide the public a shared design or co-design and possibly be part of the decision when recommendations are made. And some of the models that we've already talked about, but pretty much everything that I've shared thus far could be referenced in regards to answering, to meeting this goal. We can think about public engagement choice points. I talked about that a little bit. We can talk about strategies to ensure public engagement. We can look at the equity implementation, so the 4 steps that we talked about. And so that was to reflect, to plan with data collection, to act and to embed equity as part of the process, and to evaluate and to measure. So what are clear success outcomes? Have we accomplished them? And then how can we adapt or change and iterate this process? So those are some models to think about when we think about forming recommendations. The goal, of course, or the intent, of course, is to answer or look at core questions around forming recommendations or data collection. Did I not change that? Uh-oh, I didn't change it. Let's see. Data collection, forming recommendations. Oh, well, it's the same. What information, what method are we using to review and collect data? That's one thing. The other question that's still the same is reviewing the criteria for that information, right? So what makes data or information valid as opposed to invalid, right? What justifies those decisions? And what also justifies which groups you listen to and which groups you don't, and the time frame in which we establish to collect that data. Again, I would say, is there a mechanism for answering questions? So when we're forming recommendations, we're using data information from our public. How are we collecting that? How is that information collated and codified, or whatever we want to call it? But how is that information then collected and used? How does it shape the recommendation? And then what platforms are we using to deliver not only our intent to form this recommendation, but the actual recommendation, and how various bits of information was used as part of that process. So as I mentioned, one of the models I talked about was the choice points, the public engagement choice points. It's really modeled after the spectrum of public participation. So as part of beginning the work to form a recommendation, where are we getting our information from, and where are we at in the way of the level of engagement we're hoping to garner from our public? And then based on that, that should then tell us how we plan to engage, right? And so I would offer that this is where we are thinking through and aligning our intention and what we say our values are, because I have seen groups use collaboration or this space of partnership and consensus building and committees only to really be in a consulting level of engagement, only to really find out, well, we just wanted to hear what you have to say, and we'll keep you informed. So this is a tool to really think about, what are we saying to our public when we say we're forming a recommendation and we want to hear from you? That's a place to start. I haven't been able to see the screen very well, so if there's any questions, Rebecca, please interrupt me.
Yeah, I don't have any questions at this point, but people feel free to pop them in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, I did something and I can't see it. I also brought this up as a reminder of the 6 principles that I touched on earlier. You can look up the Kirwan Institute. I'm not sure if I saved the link somewhere. but also to use this as a guide, as a way to shape our intentions when we're looking to form recommendations, right? So prior to making the decision and prior to even informing the public, what are the ways along these 6 principles we're upholding our intention to advance equity? Where are we being more inclusive, right? So with the diversity, where are we intentionally wanting to undo the injustice that's experienced by underrecognized groups? Where are we listening? Where are we relationship building to ensure trust? And are we prepared to honor dissent and conflict in the room, right? So oftentimes people get stuck at number 5, committees or groups get stuck at number 5 because they want to advance equity, but for fear of being in a room with different opinions, they would rather not have a space where, for example, there's collaboration, because that brings, more tension and more possibly dissent and disagreement. So again, at number 5, oftentimes is where committees and groups get stuck. So knowing that, if you know that about your committee and your group, no judgment here or blame. That's a place to invest some time to say, what do we do if we don't like what we hear, or we don't necessarily like the answers that we're getting? And then the 6th principle was adaptability to community change. So we're forming a recommendation, and this may not be the end of the discussion. We may have to create more opportunities to get more information in order to form this recommendation. And I'm not saying that we should wait, we should just drag it on to make a recommendation, because there's a lot of decisions that are riding on or contingent on the recommendations that we make. But I am saying that this oftentimes default to hurry and to fast and to quick decisions oftentimes leaves people out who have historically been left out or excluded from those conversations. And then the last model that I've already raised as part of forming recommendations is looking at the model for equity and implementation, the 4 steps, right? So we have this as part of our workbook when we're thinking about, we're about to form a recommendation, and we're going to go deep into different data points, and we're going to be talking to diverse perspectives and different lived experiences. Where do we want to start before we get hung up in the data? This is often where I see our default is, let's collect the data, let's get all the information. And we already know, because we've talked about this several times, that where I am, how I ascribe, the identity I ascribe to, my understanding of history, my understanding of self, my assumptions and attitudes will shape the way I interpret and present and analyze and assess this data. So the 4 steps are meant to slow us down, I would say, as part of forming those recommendations. We can use it in other instances, but for this scenario, I would ask us to just slow down and walk through each step in a way that helps us to get to some resolution, right? So I'm really clear about how my identity is showing up in this space. I've slowed down to collect data and to include different voices. I'm really intentional about ensuring equity is part of the process. And then I've established what success outcomes are. I've said that early on as part of the plan, and I'm also committed to measuring it. And so that is it for me. Let me see. Yeah, that is it. That went faster than I thought it would go through. But what I hope you get from our time together, not only the conversations, and I'm pretty sure I repeated myself many, many times, but what I also hope you get from our time together is that there is no simple path or easy path to undo systems that have been around for as long as we can remember, right? There's a default way of being and moving and operating in this world that we're intentionally looking to undo. And we do that first by starting with ourselves. We do that also by looking at the impact that our decisions have across entire systems, right? So it's not just the one or two people that say, oh, it hasn't been that bad, it's been okay. It's across larger systems, larger communities. And we look at our history to see how has the history impacted what I'm seeing and experiencing today. And then finally, we take an equity lens. It can be something as simple as 2 or 3 questions, or it can be some of those documents that I prepared for you. It can be a huge rubric. It can be, a questionnaire, a checklist. It can be any of those things, but anything that primes us to think beyond the norm or the default, that primes us to think about what are the root causes and how might I step in and remove those embedded and pervasive barriers? How can I remove that to ensure that the public can fully engage and fully experience what the government or public service or Kitsap County has to offer, the programs and the services we provide? And that is it for me. Rebecca, do you see any questions?
I don't see any questions. And let me just, remove the pin. Put my video back on. No, thank you. I really appreciated all those sort of examples, our advisory groups, for everyone as you go into looking at your work plans and planning for presentations at your meetings for 2024, as you look at your processes for reviewing grant applications, fund distributions, review of the comprehensive plan, the critical areas ordinance. I hope that you'll, take a lot of this into your processes, into your meetings, into your committees, and, have time to be more thoughtful about how you do the work. And again, I just want to thank you so much, Lucretia, for a fantastic series of classes. All of the slides from this, the last 2 hours, will be posted on the advisory group DEI website, and that is at kcowa.us/DEI. There'll be a survey at the end of this, so please take that and give us some feedback. And I've got a bunch more resources to post up on the website. I know I'm going to be going into some of those PDFs and pulling some of the slides to incorporate into the advisory group handbook, and use them in other ways. Orientation of new members. So just be thinking about how these things that you've learned over this series of courses can be applied to your advisory groups, into your own life and other organizations that you work with. Let me look, there's one. Oh, it's a thank you from Beth. Yeah. The recording will be posted. I'm hoping for people that couldn't attend or missed it, that they'll go back, and please encourage others to come view the videos, and maybe have a watch party. If you have a retreat coming up, you could have a watch party, or take some of the tools out of the toolkits and work through them, and use part of your retreat to ask some of these important questions and apply them to the work that you're doing moving forward. And I think that's one thing I hear from our county advisory groups a lot is, how can we get more people engaged in what we're doing, attending our meetings, applying to serve on the different committees, or even some of our councils have committees where they're not appointed people, but they're other opportunities for the public to get involved in the work we do. So you think about the committees that you have and how you can encourage people that have barriers that can attend a monthly meeting and have other obligations, but maybe they can join a committee, during an ad hoc period and provide some input. I'm also available to help with resources as far as outreach into the community with different organizations and key communicators in different communities. And so I just want to put myself out there as well as a resource to you, if you're looking to find just ways of being better at being more inclusive and bringing more people into the work that we do here. So thank you all. Marcia has an example to share. Marcia, did you want to speak for a minute? Well, you can't answer that because you're muted. Let me see if I can pull you up here really quick. Just a second. Let me find you. Let's see. There you are. Okay. So Marcia, I think you can unmute now if you wanted to talk.
Yeah. I recently had a learning experience about this, as I'm serving on a committee that's designing a trail. And I was asked, I'm a white, straight, cis woman who's had the privilege of a lot of education. And so I sort of figure that, if I go into a group, I can probably, know what they're talking about and, be useful in some way. But I found myself, and I should say I was invited to be part of this group because I use a wheelchair and they wanted that perspective in the group. But I know nothing about maps and engineering and all that kind of stuff. And at one point they were considering, excuse me, a whole bunch of mini sections of this trail. And we were supposed to, I think we were supposed to like give them a numeric rating and get that back to them by the time of the next meeting. And I was completely lost. And, because that's not my usual experience, I think it was easier for me to admit that I was lost. I didn't feel like it reflected on my whole being that I didn't understand this. But it was still hard to figure out how to go about getting the information that I needed. And luckily for me, there had been one guy who I had spent a little bit more time with during one of our field sessions. And so I felt a little bit more comfortable in asking him. And the other challenge was this stuff was all in color, and I only have a black and white printer. And so that was also a problem. So I did call this guy and tell him what I was struggling with. And he arranged for the slides to get printed off for me. And then we spent probably an hour walking through them. But it really brought it home to me that it isn't enough just to invite someone to be part of the committee if they don't have the background to understand and contribute to what the committee is trying to do. So thank you.
Man, I love that lesson learned, Marcia. I love that story that you're sharing. What's sticking with me is it isn't enough to just invite someone. And so that to me is the basis of inclusion, right? Here, just come see and do. But the idea that having the experience behind that is really helpful. Yes, I appreciate that story and bringing it. That was a good mic drop.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. Excellent. Well, anybody else have any parting thoughts they want to share? Again, thank you all for being here, whether you're staff or you're an advisory group member, taking the extra time to join this class. And again, I hope that you'll take what you've learned back to your committees, and take advantage of the resources and provide us with feedback through the survey. I am always open to hearing from you anytime. So my email is rpirtle, PIRTLE @kitsap.gov, and you're welcome to contact me anytime. My information is also on the advisory group website. So thank you all for being here, and we'll call it a wrap. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank everyone else. Yeah.